In this session, we're going to be looking at learning theories of addiction and using learning theory as a way of understanding the development, maintenance and changes and recovery from addictive behaviours. We're going to be using the key concepts of operant and classical conditioning and considering how they can be applied to understanding addictive behaviours. And in doing so, then looking at some of the specific conditioned responses that are thought to emerge as a result of the learned process or experience of addictive behaviour. By the end of the session, you should be able to describe the principles of operant and classical conditioning, and I'll say a bit about those in more general terms at the start, and also give examples of the role of conditioned responses in addictive behaviour, and understand some of the drug opposite conditioned responses, and what I mean by that will make more sense as we go through the session. And you should also then be able to critically evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of a learning theory approach to understanding addictive behaviour. Now, the first thing I would say, just as a bit of a preamble to the session before we jump into thinking about addictive behaviours and learning theory in general, is to say that it's important to understand learning theory in its historical context within psychology, which is as an overall model of understanding the development of human behaviour and learning. Learning theorists, or sometimes referred to as behaviourists, took the view that human behaviour in its entirety can be understood as the process of learning. That is to say that none of our behaviour is thought to be from a learning or behavioural perspective, to be innate or born within us, and all of the behaviours that we enact over time are things that are the product of the learning that we go through. If you read around this subject, or if you're already familiar with it, you may have heard of the phrase tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate, which was an important concept for learning theorists, whereby they argued that when you are born a tabula rasa, you're a completely blank slate, and the person that you go on to become, your personality, the behaviours, your likes and dislikes and preferences and so on, are all entirely shaped by the environment in which you developed as an individual. That's a really important thing to keep in mind as we work through and think about and look at the ways in which learning theory has been applied to understanding addictive behaviour, because while on the face of it, the notion that as a person you develop and your experiences have this sort of impact on you over time, while that idea kind of on the face of it makes a lot of sense, it does exclude certain other ways of learning, and particularly some of the more socially focused aspects of learning, like learning from the observation of another person. From a learning theorist perspective, you can only learn through your own direct experience. Therefore, if you observe another person doing something and you think, that person seems to be enjoying the behaviour or the thing that they're doing, as far as learning theory is concerned, that's not a learning process for you. You can't actually learn in that way. So therefore, in order to decide whether or not you want to do something, whether you get any kind of pleasure or reinforcement from it, the only way to learn about that is to do the behaviour yourself. And so learning theory sits historically as one of the older, albeit still more powerful models of understanding human psychology and development. But it's important to acknowledge that and understand that it's not the absolute limit of our understanding. In the historical context, there was something referred to as the cognitive revolution in psychology, which was essentially a reaction to extreme forms of learning theory, arguably, where this idea was that in effect nothing that goes on inside your head really matters, that everything is to do with understanding the kind of learned experiences and the things that happen to you externally, with no consideration for internal mental processes. The cognitive revolution was effectively an attempt to put the mind back into the science of mind and behaviour, which is how we currently think of psychology. So I'll kind of keep making reference back to that as we work through some of the applications of learning theory to addictive behaviours specifically. If you're not already familiar with it, learning theory is worth reading about. It's really an important development in the history of psychological science. And the other thing to mention about it before I move on is to say that what you'll often find is that learning theory, rather than having been out and out rejected and replaced by a kind of new models and ways of understanding human behaviour, even including sort of more neuroscientific understandings of the human brain, learning theory is actually, I always present it as being an incomplete way of understanding human behaviour. The core principles that learning theorists refer to, which I'll come on to in a second, are not wrong. The ways in which learning theorists understood human learning and the impact of our experiences on shaping our behaviour over time aren't completely wrong. They're just incomplete. There are other ways in which we learn and our behaviour develops and our personalities are shaped and so on and so forth. And so what you see very often when you look at more recent conceptualisations of either human behaviour or indeed addictive behaviour specifically is that you see the underpinning concepts that come from learning theory, but you see that there's a more sophisticated way of understanding human behaviour. So learning theory is a really good place to start when we're trying to understand addictive behaviours, for that reason that it really gets at some of the more foundational processes that underpin the development of addictive behaviours, as indeed with many other behaviours. So the first really important concept in learning theory is this idea of operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning can best be described as learning by doing. Operant conditioning happens, and by conditioning it's a term used often interchangeably, although it doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but interchangeably with the idea of learning. So operant conditioning or operant learning is essentially what happens as a result of you doing something and getting some kind of reaction in the world around you, either positive or negative. When we talk about positive consequences from your behaviour or positive experiences, the term used in learning theory is reinforcement. When we talk about positive reinforcement, the idea of positive reinforcement, you'll probably be familiar with it, it sounds probably quite self-evident, is that positive reinforcement increases the probability of you doing something again because you've been presented with a reward. So you've done something, and as a result of the thing that you've done, there's been some positive reward that's emerged or occurred that you've experienced, and therefore that positive experience that you've had of the reward increases the probability of you doing it again. And that's really important when we understand learning theorists' perspective on human behaviour, is that it's not that we learn things instantaneously, it's about probabilities. In any given situation there are lots of different decisions and choices you can make based on your past experiences and preferences and so on. And learning theorists really see this as a sort of an ongoing process over a long period of time where you develop certain preferences and certain behaviours and responses may become more kind of salient to you or more likely to be chosen, but it's not to say that in any given situation you only ever have one choice. You have multiple choices, and so processes like positive reinforcement will start to tip the balance in favour of certain things. You take, for example, friendships. If you have a group of friends or people in your life and some of them simply make you happier, you seem to get on better, you have less friction, you sort of enjoy the company of certain people, then the idea would be that over time you may increase the amount of time that you spend with that particular group and correspondingly decrease the amount of time that you spend with another group. So it's a slow shaping of behaviour over time through this important notion of operant conditioning and positive reinforcement. And the specific and the most obvious example of this in the context of addictive behaviours is the idea that your behaviour would be to take a drug and the reward would be a feeling of getting high. If when you take a drug it makes you feel good, then it's going to increase the likelihood that you would do it again. And it seems self-evident to say it, but it's a really important thing to consider in terms of how people's behaviours change. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is often misunderstood or misinterpreted as being the same thing as punishment, and punishment isn't the same thing as negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is essentially what happens when your behaviour that you've engaged in has led to the removal of some discomfort. So unlike the idea of being in the presence of a group of people who make you laugh, so you're around a group of friends and you just really get on and you have a great time, there may be other people that you spend time around who make you feel less sad. Maybe if you're dealing with anxiety or depression or low affect, low mood, and being in the company of certain people just simply makes you feel more comfortable, then that's an example of negative reinforcement, a behaviour that you do, something, a situation that you engage in, which leads to the removal of a discomfort. So it's not necessarily a positive reward, it's not making you feel kind of better than average, so to speak, but it's the removal of some discomfort. And the really obvious example of negative reinforcement in the context of addiction would be withdrawal. When a person's going through withdrawal from a drug, taking the drug will remove that withdrawal. So, and very often, I've given the example of positive reinforcement and getting high for somebody who is, for example, a long-term injecting drug user taking heroin. Many people, once they've had an extended period of using the drug, will have developed such a high level of tolerance to the drug that they actually no longer report getting high. When they use the drug, really all it does is alleviate the withdrawal symptoms. So there's no sense in which they're kind of experiencing this high euphoric effect that they may have experienced early on when they were using a drug like heroin. But over time your tolerance gets so high that you're kind of constantly really just fending off the withdrawals, and so taking the drug is a way of removing the withdrawal, and that's negative reinforcement. You can see how in that example I've just given of a drug like heroin, that positive reinforcement may be more important early on when a person begins using the drug, because it's making them feel a certain way and they like the feeling, they want to experience that again. But because of the way that drug operates on the body, the way the body responds to it, things like tolerance will develop, withdrawal symptoms will become more serious and stronger, and so then what you're left with is a negative reinforcement that occurs over time. So these two interacting processes of reinforcement can be really powerful shapers of behaviour, particularly if the responses or the rewards that you're getting themselves are very strong. Another really important principle in operant conditioning is what we call the principle of contiguity, which is a really simple idea, and again, as with many of these models of human behaviour, it can often seem when you say it quite self-evident, but it's important that we acknowledge them. This idea that the most effective reinforcement is given immediately after a behaviour. So if you do something now and you don't get a reward for doing it until 3 months down the line, the idea would be that the connection between those two things, between the thing that you did and the reward or reinforcement that you experienced, is going to be very, very weak, because as far as learning theorists were concerned, the simple fact that you know that reward was kind of created by the behaviour that you did. So for example, saving money, the fact that you know that saving a small amount of money over a long period of time led to you being able to purchase something that that you really, really wanted. The fact that you know that kind of cognitively is sort of irrelevant in terms of the strength of your learning, because the more effective way to learn something is to ensure contiguity, closeness in time between the behaviour and the outcome. And that applies just as much to punishment, which I'll say something about in just a moment, as it does to reinforcement. An important example here in the context of addictive behaviour and drug use in particular is to think about what this means with regards to the mode of administration of a drug. If you administer a drug orally, then when you take the drug, you swallow it, it goes down into your stomach acid, it has to be digested and go through the intestines and so on before eventually it ends up in the bloodstream. So taking a drug orally is almost pretty much the slowest way of getting a drug into your bloodstream so that it can have a psychoactive effect in the brain. So it's a very inefficient means of getting a drug into the body, and as this graph shows here, it's taken from White's 91 textbook. The dotted line there with the sort of the lowest peak reflects the maximum concentration of a drug given in a particular dose over time, and you can see what happens there in that graph is that it's a very low peak concentration of the drug in the blood, and it takes a longer time to get to the peak. And part of the reason for that will be that obviously if you're taking a drug, you ingest it, it goes into the stomach acid, pretty much your body begins to digest, even through saliva in the mouth, almost immediately. So your body's metabolizing the drug and breaking it down before all of it can get into the bloodstream, and of course it's taking longer to get there because it's the longer route. It has to go through the digestive system. If you compare that to, say, intramuscular administration, so putting into a bum cheek or an arm, then effectively what you're doing is getting it closer to directly into the bloodstream, although not completely. So injecting into a muscle means that the drug is taken up through the capillaries in your arm or wherever it may be, and is absorbed through the capillaries and eventually gets into the bloodstream. From there gets into your bloodstream and has an effect. But so that's quicker in terms of how quickly the drug will get into your bloodstream, and you'll peak higher because less of it's being broken down by, say, stomach acid and so on and so forth. But it pales in comparison to the speed with which a drug can get into your body if you just inject intravenously. If you inject a drug intravenously, you'll get a very high peak and it'll be very quick, because there's almost no intervening, there's pretty much no intervening process by which any of the drug can be either slowed down in its absorption or indeed metabolized before it gets there. So intravenous administration of a drug is going to be a very powerful way of reinforcing the need to use, because you're going to get this really strong effect immediately, but it's also then going to diminish very quickly. And it's interesting when you look at the use of drugs amongst injecting drug users, that very often people do transition through either smoking or intramuscular injection to eventually moving on to intravenous injections. There aren't that many people who would begin as intravenous or injecting drug users, and part of the reason for that is, of course, going back to this idea of the development of tolerance and negative reinforcement, that if you're developing greater tolerance to the drug through either intramuscular or oral or inhalation of the drug, if you're developing a greater degree of tolerance, then actually one way in which you can try to overcome that tolerance in the short term would be to move on to, say, for example, intravenous administration, because you're going to get a higher concentration more quickly. But eventually even that you'll develop tolerance to, as I described previously. But this idea of contiguity is important. It's important in health behaviour in general, because unfortunately, if you think about the rewards and reinforcements and punishments, if you do any particular behaviour from an operant conditioning perspective, it's never as simple as you do a thing and there is a single outcome. You'll do a thing and there'll be lots of outcomes. I'm kind of describing this in simplistic terms to get the concepts across effectively, but in reality, as in life as we know, it's messy. You do something and there may be some rewards and some punishments, and from a learning theorist perspective, it's the balance of those things. It's which was stronger. Was it generally more positive than it was negative in terms of the consequences of something you've done, and that's going to have an impact on shaping your behaviour over time. But if you think about a lot of health behaviours, whether it's having unprotected sex, whether it's even things like looking after yourself, dieting, eating healthy, and so on and so forth, very often we're unfortunately in a situation where the odds are stacked against us, because usually the positive consequences of the things that we may do, the reinforcement that we get, will happen far sooner and far more quickly and more contiguously with the actual behaviour than any of the negative consequences. Smoking, for example, is one of the most dangerous and damaging in terms of overall impact on public health activities that people do. But actually, that individual fag doesn't kill you. Having a cigarette now itself does not lead to you dying young or becoming more ill or taking long to recover if you get sick from something else. And so the immediate reinforcement of smoking a cigarette, if you're dependent, sort of nicotine dependent, the immediate reinforcement that you get is very immediate, whereas any positive benefits that come from stopping in the long term are in the future. Thinking about long-term health, actually you could be talking literally decades down the line in terms of not dying in your 60s and maybe dying in your 80s. That's way off. And also any of the negative consequences themselves, any punishment, any aversive outcome itself will also be later down the line. So a lot of the time in health behaviour change, one of the things that we're struggling with essentially is the contiguity that goes with the behaviour. That if you do this thing now, it will make you feel good, even if tomorrow morning, taking alcohol for example, you may have a hangover. Well, yeah, okay, you may have a hangover if you drink too much, but that still comes later. The thing that came first was the enjoyment that you had at the time of drinking a lot of alcohol, if it was making you feel good or giving you some consequence or reinforcement that you desired. So some other key principles about operant conditioning, this learning by doing. One thing that we've learned is that intermittent reinforcement strengthens a behaviour, and by intermittent reinforcement, this is really important in the context of gambling. Intermittent reinforcement means that you're not necessarily rewarded every single time you do something. It could be that you're rewarded every 4th, 5th or 10th time that you do a behaviour. Now, if you know that there's a certain ratio, we call that a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. So if you do something 5 times, on the 6th occasion you do it, there'll be some sort of benefit. But the strongest way to shape behaviour is actually with what we call variable ratio reinforcement. Variable ratio reinforcement is essentially a fruit machine, or pretty much all types of gambling, where you know that there will eventually be a positive reinforcement. There'll be a reward, and there could be quite a big reward depending on what if in the context of gambling, what game you're playing. There could be a really strong reward, but actually you don't know when it's going to come. And the reason that strengthens a behaviour is this sort of like this sense of almost anticipation, that you have to keep going, because if you haven't won yet, you know that you could win on, even on the next spin of the dice, roll of the dice or spin of the wheel, but you don't know for sure. And so intermittent reinforcement can actually be a really powerful reinforcer and shaper of behaviour. I said I was going to say something about punishment. What I want to say about punishment is that animals learn, and including humans, to avoid as well as escape discomfort. So punishment itself is actually not a great way of shaping behaviour. If you punish somebody, then depending on the nature of the punishment, that itself can be very attention grabbing. That if whether it's smacking a child or putting somebody in prison or whatever else, if the punishment is very extreme, then actually the human, the animal or human's attention is focused almost entirely on the punishment itself. There's a disconnect then with the things that they did that may have led to the punishment, and instead what can happen is that the focus is more on how do they avoid or escape that punishment. And of course, avoiding or escaping punishment isn't necessarily the same thing as not doing the thing that led to that in the first place. So if, for example, you are in a relationship with somebody and you're drinking very heavily, and every time you kind of get drunk or come home drunk, your partner gets really upset and angry with you, and you have a big argument. Well, of course, one way of dealing with that would be to try and address your drinking. Another way of dealing with it would be to try to hide your drinking. And of course, we often hear reported for people with problems of addictive behaviour that deceptive sort of behaviours or hiding the addiction from other people can be very common. And again, that's important if you then think about the sort of the punishments that may go along with kind of being caught out, so to speak. So reinforcement, a sort of a positive approach to shaping behaviour, is far more powerful than punishment, because punishment can lead to these kind of perverse outcomes, rather than encouraging somebody to reflect on and maybe do something about a problem they may have with alcohol or drugs or gambling or whatever it may be. You could in an unintended way cause that person to realise that you're no longer a safe person to speak to, because you're just going to give them a load of grief. And so the way they deal with that is not to change the behaviour, but to just try and do it when you're not around. Cues, and we'll come on to this in a bit more detail shortly, or discriminative stimuli, are really important because in addition to learning and our behaviour being shaped by the consequences that we come to expect from what we do, which is the idea of operant conditioning, the context in which we learn is important as well. We learn that in different situations, certain reinforcements or punishments may be more or less likely. So the context in which learning takes place is also really important, and I'll say more on that in just a moment. The strength of learning, so how quickly you learn and how powerfully learned or reinforced a behaviour becomes, and how dominant a behaviour becomes, will be influenced by the nature of the reinforcer, by which I mean, the strength of the response that you get. Are you smoking a cigarette, or are you taking heroin? There are two very different psychoactive reactions to that. And different drugs, in the context of drug dependence, different drugs do have different kind of strengths of effect, if you like. We know that the schedule of reinforcement, which is what I referred to just now, intermittent reinforcement, the schedule of reinforcement is important. So how often and for how long are you reinforced or punished? Or positively or negatively reinforced, of course, and also how long that schedule of reinforcement is in place for. So these things all influence the way in which we learn. There are probably factors beyond this too. Now, underpinning all of this, there's an important question. Why is it that humans and animals, why do we learn in this way? Well, the reason we learn in this way is because in evolutionary history we've developed something called the reward pathway. More specifically, the mesolimbic dopaminergic reward pathway, which involves these particular brain regions. I'll show you a diagram in just a moment. You can see broadly where it sits. Now, This is really important. We talk about operant and classical conditioning and learning theory in the context of addiction. It can sound as though it's sort of a problematic thing, the fact that we can be so influenced in this way to behave. But if you step back from addictive behaviours or other forms of behaviours that have negative consequences in the long run, it actually makes a great deal of sense that the human brain has evolved in such a way to be able to detect rewards in its environment and to sort of log them and to attach them to behaviours, to learn that if I do X, then positive outcome Y will follow. The fact that your brain automatically logs that is really useful, because it means that over time you'll come to increase the frequency with which you do things that lead to reinforcements of some kind, and decrease the frequency with which you do things that either lead to punishments or to kind of neutral outcomes that are neither here nor there. So it's actually a very efficient way to be learning. The things that you do, the experiences that you have, if you didn't learn from them, would be even more problematic. The problem with addiction and the reward pathways, and particularly with drug addiction, although we see similar things with gambling as well, partly because of the very clever way in which various different gambling activities have been designed, they almost sort of hijack the reward pathways. Almost all drugs of dependence or dependence-producing drugs seem to increase the release of dopamine in the reward pathway. Now, dopamine is the drug that signals to your brain that a reward has just occurred. So if you do something, if I tell a great joke in class and everybody laughs, it may lead to an increase in dopamine in my brain. That's my brain's trigger to kind of record on the timeline of my experience that thing that I just did just then led to something that I enjoyed, to a positive, rewarding outcome. And one of the problems with drugs is that they artificially increase the release of dopamine. They also slow down and inhibit its reuptake. It's important in terms of neurotransmitters in the brain. The brain releases neurotransmitters of various kinds, dopamine, serotonin, and various others, to have a particular effect or to do a certain job, but then the brain reabsorbs them. Of course, if you take a drug that prevents the reabsorption of a neurotransmitter like dopamine, then the consequence is going to be this kind of hyper learning, if you like. It's a sort of an unnaturally, if you're thinking of dopamine as being the sort of the rubber stamp in the brain to say right then a good thing happened. If the dopamine isn't reabsorbed as quickly as it ordinarily might, your brain is going to have a recollection that the thing that you just did was even more rewarding than normal, far more rewarding than any other natural reward that you might experience in your environment. And that's really important if you think about a drug like nicotine, of course, because when we talk about addiction and reward, the very natural area to think about, natural drug to think about, would be something like heroin, that has a hugely euphoric positive effect for people who haven't yet developed strong tolerance. Nicotine doesn't do that. Nicotine's an odd drug in that sense, isn't it? Because it doesn't, people don't talk about smoking cigarettes as the most brilliant thing they've ever done in their life, and yet nicotine can be a really difficult drug. Tobacco can be a really difficult drug for people to get off. And it's because this almost your subjective experience is slightly detached from what your brain is recording happened. And this all links back to this idea of the reward pathways. So here, just looking at where this sits within the human brain, it's actually part of the more primitive part of the brain, the region of the brain that in evolutionary terms developed more far earlier on. It's also the region of the brain that's the most similar to other primates. So the higher brains or higher functions of the brain, the corpus, the cortices, and so on, that's the part of the brain that differs the most if you compare humans to other higher primates. But this kind of central region of the brain, sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain, is very, very similar in humans and many other animals. And it serves these really basic functions of kind of, aside from things like physical homeostatic regulation in the body, it also serves functions around basic emotions. And also this associative learning that we do, that really is what we're talking about here. So a really simplistic summary then, just to sort of go over what I guess I've just said in terms of operant conditioning. In terms of the development of drug dependence specifically, you have to experiment. There has to be a point at which you first use a drug for some reason. So experimentation with a drug would lead to positive reinforcement. So you take a drug and it makes you feel a certain way that is good, that's positive reinforcement. From a learning theory perspective, that increases the likelihood or the probability that you're going to do it again in future, because it's a thing that you have experienced as a positive thing, and therefore you're more likely to use again in future, and that will keep on going. What then happens over time for almost all drugs to which people can develop problems, and indeed to drugs to which people don't develop problems as well, or at least in the same to the same extent, people develop tolerance. When you develop tolerance, that simply means that the same dose of the drug doesn't have the same effect that it used to. And whether that's if you've ever gone for a long period of time without drinking coffee, for example, maybe you've been off work and maybe you don't, like me, tend not to drink coffee at home, and as a result of that, you sort of you experience more tolerance to it. It kind of makes you feel a bit more wired the next time you use it. Even more common experience would be women during pregnancy who don't drink alcohol may find that when they have a drink again after the baby's arrived, that a smaller amount of alcohol will make them feel more intoxicated than it otherwise would have previously. So tolerance can develop to the effect of many types of drugs, including things like sleeping tablets, antidepressants, and so on. As a result of the development of tolerance, if you're looking for a particular experience or effect from a drug, then you may increase your use to try to get that same feeling. What that will eventually lead to is that the more of a drug that you're taking, the more likely you are to experience more serious or severe withdrawal symptoms, which would usually be the opposite to the effect of the drug. So take, for example, sleeping tablets. Many people are unaware that if you take sleeping tablets, particularly prescription as opposed to something over the counter, prescription sleeping tablets, the withdrawal syndrome from stopping taking sleeping tablets will be insomnia or difficulty getting to sleep. Similarly with antidepressants, when people, if you were on antidepressants to try and increase your sort of positive affect or low mood, and you stop taking them abruptly, then chances are for a period of time afterwards that actually the withdrawal would be low affect or low mood. If you're dependent to a stimulant drug, then taking it off would be the hypostimulation. So as a consequence of experiencing withdrawal, what you'll have learned over your career of using a drug, and I don't just mean heroin, cocaine and things like that, but also things like coffee. The particular experience of mine a while back, I sort of found that I was drinking lots and lots of coffee at work during the week, and at the weekends I was sort of hit with this lethargy, and I thought, God, this is I'm really, this is I'm just knackered, I'm burning out and so on. And I was quite busy, but actually I sort of eventually put two and two together and thought, this is because I do not drink coffee at home. And I found that if I had a coffee in the morning, say on a Saturday, I'd really perk up. It was quite a marked effect. What I also did was then to try and reduce the amount of coffee that I'd drink Monday to Friday, so as not to experience that sort of withdrawal. But it is a real thing. So if you've ever been through a period of just not drinking any alcohol at all for a while, and indeed if you do the same with coffee, that you find that you get this, you can experience this kind of mild withdrawal. If you experience withdrawal, what that's going to lead to is an increase in drug seeking, exactly as I just described. The short-term solution for me, feeling really lethargic at the weekend because I'm not drinking coffee, was to have a cup of coffee or two in the morning on a Saturday and a Sunday. The long term was to think, do I really want to keep on dosing myself up on it quite as much and aim for some sort of balance? But of course, that's nonetheless negative reinforcement. By taking the drug, it takes away the withdrawal symptoms, it takes away the aversive negative experience that you're having. And that over time, if that gets out of control, is what can lead to drug dependence, this cycle that you're in of being physiologically and often psychologically dependent on a drug. Now, just from a pure learning theory perspective, there are a couple of things to point out here that can be problematic in terms of explaining addiction at large, because it seems, as I've explained it, and if you take me exactly at my word, it can seem really powerful, and you think, actually maybe this is exactly how all addiction happens. But if you look at this, one question would be, why do people experiment? If from a learning theorist perspective all of your behaviour is shaped by your own personal experiences and can't be shaped by what we call vicarious experiences of doing something because you've seen somebody else do it, because me seeing you do something doesn't mean that I can learn and experience a reward or reinforcement from it. So what leads to experimentation? Learning theories, you could say social pressure, peer pressure. From a learning theorist perspective, those sorts of things can't have an effect on your behaviour. Peer pressure can't have a direct effect because that really, I can only experience peer pressure internally as a cognitive process, surely. I can, thinking about what you think of me, and if I don't do that, you'll think that I'm not cool, for example. So experimentation, why it is that a person initially does something, can be problematic from a pure learning theorist perspective, giving an explanation as to why somebody did it. But positive reinforcement, of course, can also be problematic. Many young people, when they first start drinking alcohol, won't like it. There's a reason the alcohol industry developed alcohol pops, to try and provide alcoholic drinks that in no way taste like the traditional alcoholic drinks, because the taste can be quite aversive to a young person's palate. Equally, smoking. People who when they first begin smoking, we often report coughing up a lung. If you inject heroin or use heroin, even smoke heroin for the first time, you'll be very lucky if you don't completely sort of empty your guts and be sick. So positive reinforcement isn't always a direct consequence of the first time a person uses a drug. Gambling, the idea that to develop a problem with gambling, that you have to really win big the very first time that you do it and get this major positive reinforcement, is of course a nonsense. Most people, the first time they place a bet, will lose. So there's a question mark there over how important positive reinforcement is in the early stages of the development of a problem. So there are some of these limitations, not kind of absolutely killer problems for learning theory, but there are some questions when you start to think about the true complexity of how a person can get into a situation where they've developed a serious addiction problem. There are some limitations to the model. Now, I've spoken about operant conditioning, which is learning by doing, and I've also alluded to what I want to come on to now, which is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning relates to what I mentioned earlier in regards to cue-based learning, or the importance of discriminative stimuli. If you're familiar with the work of Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, this is classic psychological experiment whereby dogs were trained to salivate in response to hearing a bell. That's classical conditioning. It's sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning, after Pavlov, who did some of that seminal work in the area. And classical conditioning is this idea, it's not so much learning by doing, it's learning by association. You learn to respond in a particular way when a particular stimulus or cue is presented. As a result, the idea is that you are presenting a person with an unconditioned stimulus, which elicits So classical conditioning then, so I now want to come on to classical conditioning, which I've already alluded to earlier. We've looked at operant conditioning and the role that can play in the development of addictive behaviours and behaviours in general. And now I want to say something about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is what I was referring to or alluding to earlier when I spoke about cue-based learning, or the importance of discriminative stimuli. It's this simple idea that classical conditioning happens So now I want to come on to classical conditioning. We've spoken about operant conditioning, which is learning by doing. It's learning through your own direct experience. But I also mentioned earlier the importance of cues and discriminative stimuli in your environment, the things that are around you when your learning happens. So if we understand operant conditioning as learning by doing, then we can understand classical conditioning as learning by association, learning to connect certain cues, certain stimuli, which can include internal feelings, it can include objects around us, it can include other people, it can include various different things of that kind, where we learn that behaviours that we do are appropriate and even expected in certain situations. And so that's described as what we refer to here as this stimulus-response relationship, this idea that a response to a behaviour is triggered by a stimulus in your environment. The classic model of this was based on work by Pavlov, and so often this is referred to as Pavlovian conditioning. You may be familiar with it. There was this idea that there's the dogs were trained to salivate in response to the sound of a bell. And the way this happens goes like this, and the terminology we use here around unconditioned and conditioned stimuli I'll explain as we go. So an unconditioned stimulus is effectively a stimulus in your environment that elicits a response which you haven't actually learned. It would usually be something quite kind of instinctual. So for example, if you smell a nice food stuff, then you'll begin to salivate as a result. And the reason for that is that it's your body preparing itself to start masticating and chewing food. You salivate. That's the reason you salivate. It's not because you're thinking, oh, that food smells lovely. It's because your body's going, oh, I'm about to eat something. I need to produce saliva. That's the purpose of saliva. So the idea of that being unconditioned is it's something that's completely automatic. It's not something that you learn as a result of your experience in life. It's just a sort of an automatic bodily response. Similarly, like taking a drug that increases your heart rate, it's an unconditioned stimulus. You've not been conditioned. If you take a stimulant, you don't have to take it loads of times in order for your body to raise its heart rate. It doesn't take a while for you to use a stimulant drug several times over. A stimulant is a stimulant, and it will simply cause an increase in your heart rate. It's how your body reacts to that drug, that unconditioned stimulus. And then in a sort of a classic experiment of this kind, you would take a neutral stimulus being something that doesn't elicit this unconditioned response. So sticking with the idea of salivation in homage to Pavlov's work, we take a neutral stimulus, like, for example, a bell. A bell ringing does not cause, in this case, the unconditioned response of salivation. What you then do is that you pair repeatedly the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, meaning, in this case, you ring a bell every time you present a dog or a person indeed with food. And if you do that over and over and over again, effectively what happens is this neutral stimulus becomes conditioned. It becomes a conditioned stimulus, meaning that it can actually elicit a conditioned response of salivation, even in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus of food. So if, in effect, ring the bell loads and loads of times every time you present food, take the food away and ring the bell, the dog or the person will salivate, because there's this learned connection in the brain. The brain has picked up on that pattern and association and has come to expect that whenever a bell is heard, that will mean food is coming. So it's a really simple, but again, really powerful learning process. And you can see how that can be quite useful in your life in general, learning that certain behaviours or responses are appropriate in different social situations, in different settings, outside of the context of ringing bells to make people salivate or indeed addictive behaviours specifically. This learning by the use of discriminative stimuli can help you to know when certain behaviours are more or less appropriate, and when your context changes, your behaviour then changes to become more appropriate as you go. A really sad, actually, one of these often used as an example of one of the experiments that really reinforced the importance of having ethics in social science research and psychological research more broadly. The Little Albert experiment was one conducted by Watson, one of the early pioneers and leaders of the development of learning theory. Did this experiment involving a Little Albert. And essentially what this experiment demonstrated, what they did in the experiment was essentially to present Little Albert with a white rat. And when he saw the white rat, it was a little fluffy white rat, very happy as a child would be. But then what they did was to bang 2 metal bars behind his head, and to do that multiple times over. So that essentially what then happened is that the rat elicited a fear response. Because of course, if every time you see this white rat, somebody's banging a metal bar behind your head, of course you're going to be fearful, because you're going to be worried that something bad's going to happen. So that association was developed. And it also extended to other similar objects, so people with a white beard, Santa, and so on. So it's a very sort of a dark experiment in the history of psychological research, and it's worth reading around again if you're interested in this topic as to some of the controversy that sat around it, because there were a number of things other than just what I've explained, a number of things that make this a very poor part of our history, quite frankly, in psychology. What this did demonstrate, though, the contribution that this makes to our understanding, and just to reinforce, we absolutely could have done this in a far less abusive way, quite frankly. But what it does demonstrate, and the reason that we still refer to this experiment, is that it's one of the strongest examples of classical conditioning involving emotion. That classical conditioning isn't just about dogs salivating and about learning to link certain behaviours with certain cues. It's that conditioning can condition emotion. That classical conditioning can lead to strong emotions being linked to certain cues that in the past would never have elicited that response. And more specifically, they can trigger negative emotions in the absence of the presentation of something that should elicit an emotion anyway. So classical conditioning is something that can shape emotional responses, not just behavioural responses. And it's also thought that classical conditioning can underlie some phobias. So example of that, arachnophobia. I'm not arachnophobic. I wouldn't describe myself as arachnophobic, but I do recall when I was younger my mum being really, really fearful of spiders. And if there was a spider in the kitchen, she would have a really kind of open, fearful response about the fact there was a spider. I've got young kids now, and I'm very conscious of when I see a spider. I do get, okay, if it's a massive one, it kind of freaks me out a little bit. And it go up the Hoover, or my wife will say I've got to put it in a cup, but up the Hoover, I'm afraid. But I'm very conscious of if I show fear, if I kind of overreact and scream or whatever else, and my children see it, they will learn to associate seeing a spider with me having that negative response, which will make them anxious. And so things like phobias, so that's not an example of an extreme phobia. I'm not arachnophobic, I'm just a bit about spiders. But in extreme circumstances, you can see how that could lead to the development of phobias, or just even aversions to things, people not liking things because they associate other situations with negative situations and experiences they've had with that particular thing. Just one more story, and apologies to those of you that aren't fans of spiders, but when my son was very young, he was in his bedroom. I think I was decorating at the time, so I had the bed in the middle of the room and things, and I went around the side, and he was probably about three years old, I reckon, at the time, and he was standing there, and he was kind of holding his hands cupped. Said, "What are you doing there, darling?" And he said, "Daddy, look, I've got Mr. Skinny Legs," and he had this massive spider in his hand. And of course, to him, at the age of 3, there wasn't this kind of immediate sort of aversive reaction, and I kind of, at the time, held it all together. "Oh, that's really nice, darling, lovely, Mr. Skinny Legs, let's put him somewhere that's not in the house." But you can see how that sort of that had I kind of screamed or gone, "Oh God, drop that," or whatever else, that would have worried him. A little 3-year-old kid seeing his grown up around him getting really fearful, and so that's how this kind of classical conditioning can end up associating certain things that never used to elicit a negative emotional response that can end up eliciting that kind of response, not because of the spider in that case itself, but because of what he remembers his dad doing, or possibly could have remembered his dad doing had I reacted in that way. So bringing it back to an example, or examples related to addictive behaviours, think about the sorts of potential cues that could become classically conditioned over time. For an injecting drug user, it would be the equipment, the presence of needles and a rubber band and burnt spoons and foil and so on and so forth. A location, people often, and the cook-up ritual, people often become very ritualised in their drug use behaviour. I recall doing some interviews a number of years back, and an ex-injecting drug user saying to me that they'd remembered having to change the lock on their bathroom door, because at home in their flat, even though they lived alone, they'd always go into the bathroom and lock the door. And once they were in recovery, they said it was just the sound of that click on the door, because it had a particular sound, and it just triggered these thoughts. It triggered thoughts about using heroin or cooking up, because it was just a strong, classically conditioned cue. Another ex-student of mine, in fact, I remember saying to me that whenever he saw anything silver on the floor, even 15 years into his recovery, any sort of silver, anything on the floor would always grab his attention. He found it very difficult to sort of, to move attention away from it. So these kinds of classically conditioned cues can be really powerful in terms of triggering thoughts about drug use. Also, things like psychological state, if you think about the reason that many people may use alcohol to excess in social situations, could be to do with social anxiety, feeling very uncomfortable in a crowd and feeling more relaxed if you drink. So if that's your trigger, then any time you experience that state would be your brain almost sort of offering up, well, let's have a drink as an option. And of course, physical state, and the most obvious example of that would be withdrawal, that when you experience withdrawal, you have come to learn time and time again that the best way of taking away the withdrawal feeling is to use the drug, is to do it again. So there are different types of conditioned drug responses. So if you become conditioned to, if you develop this conditioning to drugs over time, you can get drug-like and drug-opposite responses. I'm going to talk about conditioned responses, drug-opposite conditioned responses in more detail, because they have a bit more of a clinical consequence that's important to understand. I'll just very briefly say here that drug-like conditioned responses can include things like placebo effects, expecting a certain effect from a drug and even if you're not taking the drug itself, you can experience something like the effects of the drug simply because it's something you've come to expect over time. And a really good example of this, you may not have heard of the concept of needle freaking, which is that if a person is or has been an injecting drug user and you give them a syringe full of saline solution or some other inert substance, and ask them to inject, then actually this needle freaking is that they will physically react as though they've taken a low dose of the drug, even though you've said to the person, look, you've saline, taste the water, it's saline solution, you're not injecting heroin. The needle freaking occurs because even though mentally you know that you're not injecting, you can't override easily that automatic conditioned relationship of what happens when you see yourself, finding a vein, putting a needle in, pressing the syringe down, and so that's a really powerful phenomenon. But I want to talk more about drug opposite conditioned responses. So to understand what withdrawal symptoms are, it's best to think of them as compensatory reactions. So when you're taking a drug, let's say a strong stimulant drug, when you take a stimulant drug, your body's homeostatic, it's challenging the homeostasis of your body. By homeostasis, I mean this idea that your body's constantly trying to regulate all aspects of bodily function. So temperature, you sweat if you get, I always say this and then get the wrong way around, you sweat when you get hot, and that's because the water on your skin helps to cool you down, and you shiver if you get cold, because having that kind of shivering movement will help to move your body about and warm you up a little bit. So your body's constantly monitoring itself and trying to maintain homeostasis. So if you take a stimulant drug and that stimulant drug causes a big increase in your heart rate, your body will start doing things to try and reduce your heart rate, including, for example, metabolizing the drug. So if you're using a drug lots and lots and lots of times, several times a day, then eventually it sort of puts your body into this state of constantly compensating the anticipated effects of these drugs. And so they're compensatory reactions, withdrawal symptoms, and that's why then when you stop taking the drug, partly why, not entirely, but partly why when you stop taking the drug, that you experience withdrawal, because it's almost as if your body overshoots. When you're not taking the drug, your body's kind of continuing to try to, for example, lower heart rate, and you can end up with a suppressed heart rate. It's slightly more complicated than that psychopharmacologically, but for our present purposes, from a learning theory perspective, that's conceptually sufficient for what we're trying to understand. So a drug opposite conditioned response can mimic withdrawal symptoms. If you are presenting a person with cues that the sound of the lock on the bathroom door, it can elicit this withdrawal symptom. A mild withdrawal from heroin would take place. So if it occurs before you take the drug, if you think about what this means, if when you hear the click of that lock, you start to experience a mild withdrawal, for a drug that's a stimulant drug, a mild withdrawal will be a suppression of your heart rate. If you think what that means when you take the drug, because your heart rate dropped just before you took the dose, your peak heart rate is going to be lower than it would than if you hadn't been exposed to that cue. So what this means is that actually the drug opposite conditioned response, the withdrawal that you'll experience, the mild withdrawal that you'll experience when you're presented with cues that lead you to think that you're about to use the drug, if you actually use the drug, it will mean the total drug effect, the maximum, we'll stick with the example of heart rate, your maximum heart rate will be lower because your heart rate dropped slightly just before you use the drug. Compared to if you hadn't experienced that conditioned response of withdrawal and you took the exact same amount of the drug, your heart rate may go higher at peak. So it's a form of tolerance, a mild form of tolerance. And these reactions, importantly, can produce relapse in abstinent people. Obviously, withdrawal can be a motivator of continued use and contribute towards an element of, it's not a strong element, but nonetheless an element of tolerance in drug users. This was originally stumbled upon in some of the work carried out, the seminal work by Abraham Wickler in the 1940s, when he was discussing relapse and looking at relapse and reasons for it amongst heroin users. And in one of the veterans hospitals in America, he was interviewing ex-injecting drug users, opiate users, many months, I think it was something like 18 months after they'd been heroin free. And what he observed when he brought them back to the hospital to have a kind of a group discussion about how things were, he noticed that when people were talking about their drug use, they were exhibiting mild signs of withdrawal, not full-on withdrawal, but mild signs of withdrawal, getting a bit sniffly, watery eyes and that sort of thing. And what that led him to do, a sort of series of studies looking at this over many years with others, and I'll give some examples in a second, was this insight that actually, if you think about what's happening for a person who is becoming dependent on a drug like heroin, there's the whole pharmacological aspect to it, of course, and that's the strongest element of it by far. But what's also happening is that there is constant pairing of different cues and different experiences with the act of drug use that's conditioning a person. And that can lead to this experience of conditioned withdrawal when those cues are presented again. So to give a kind of a model based on this idea of unconditioned and conditioned responses, the unconditioned response stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus that produces the unconditioned response of withdrawal is this. You take an opiate, it's metabolized, receptors in the brain are evacuated. What that leads to, if you don't then use the drug again within a sufficiently close period of time, eventually it leads to this rebound activity and withdrawal. So that's proper withdrawal, physiological withdrawal. But what happens in parallel with that, and adds to it and attenuates the actual physiological withdrawal that you're experiencing, is this combination of conditioned stimuli, the environment or drug equipment, for example, that goes along with the use of the drug, that itself can then trigger this conditioned response of a milder form of withdrawal that you can observe in people even once they're drug-free and have been drug-free for many months, if not years. And this mild form of withdrawal can happen at the same time. So, of course, what that could mean is that your withdrawal could be more severe if both the environment and the conditioned stimuli, in this case, are presented at the same time as you're experiencing physiological withdrawal. And conditioned tolerance then can also occur. This idea of or learned form of tolerance can also happen as a result of this exact same process. And as Siegel's work back in the 70s and 80s demonstrated that this homeostatic response is something that happens in advance of drug use. So you experience a form of tolerance, a degree of tolerance prior to drug use. Conditioned withdrawal prior to drug use, which means, as I explained just now in the example of heart rate and the peak heart rate you experience, can lead to a form of conditioned tolerance because your body kind of acts to prepare itself based on an expected effect. If the expected effect is your heart rate's about to whack right up, then if you're presented with cues that suggest that that's about to happen, your body takes this kind of preparatory response that leads to this conditioned tolerance. And in the language here of unconditioned, conditioned responses and so on, the unconditioned stimulus that underpins tolerance is that you inject a drug and it has an effect. The unconditioned response to that is this homeostatic response to counter drug effects. And over time, if you keep on using a drug many, many times over, then eventually you'll develop physiological tolerance, that you will become tolerant to the exact same effect of the drug. So either you increase the amount of drug that you use in order to try and get the experience that you're looking for, or if you don't, it's likely that you will, that you'll eventually the overall drug effect could almost disappear, not entirely, but almost. What happens in parallel with this, the conditioned stimulus, are the cues that signal that a drug is about to appear. Going back to the example of hearing the lock on the bathroom door click, clunk click, and you hear that and it triggers you to think that you're about to use the drug. So the same thing happens, this homeostatic response, but it can happen in the absence of the drug. If it happens in the absence of the drug and then you don't take the drug at all, you'll experience withdrawal, conditioned withdrawal. If you subsequently take the drug, because your body has prepared itself for what the drug's about to do by doing the opposite, drug's about to increase heart rate, so body decides to drop heart rate, that can then be experienced as tolerance, conditioned tolerance. What this means clinically is that, and this has been based on the work of Wickler, Siegel and others back in the 40s, 70s, 80s and so on, is that the risk of overdose can then be greater in novel environments, because if you're using a drug, and particularly if you're strongly drug dependent and using very high doses with drugs like heroin, the amount of drug that a person takes when they are strongly dependent would have killed them had they taken that same dose at the very start of their drug use career. And so what happens is people are very often on a sort of a knife edge, using just enough that it won't lead to overdose, but any small variation can lead to overdose. And there's lots of things actually that can lead to overdose, and it's actually more often than not, it's not to do with a person using a stronger drug, changing dealer, or even doing it intentionally. More often than not, it's just bad luck. If you're using drugs like heroin, it has amphetamines and so on, it has a really serious effect on the body, and sometimes just having a sort of an arrhythmia at the time that you took the drug can lead to heart failure or a heart attack or something, or an overdose event. But what can also happen is using in a different environment means that those cues around you that would normally trigger your body to take this preparatory action, to have this kind of conditioned tolerance response, doesn't happen. And in novel environments, you don't have the same degree of tolerance, which could mean the difference between overdosing and not. And there is some evidence to support this based on interviews that Wickler conducted with overdose survivors, who frequently reported that when they overdosed, the only real difference was the place. The only real difference was where they were when it happened. And there's also an example I'll give on the next slide. I think it's the next slide, looking at overdose occurring when injecting morphine in novel environments. I'll go into that in just a second. But there's also evidence from human research showing that simple experimental paradigm, you either give people a button to press, and when they press the button, morphine will be injected through a cannula in their arm. So they know when the drug is coming, they get to choose. Versus somebody stood behind a screen about to press the button or press the syringe to administer the drug, and you don't tell the person when they're going to get it. What we find in those sorts of experiments is that actually the physiological effect of a drug like morphine is greater when it's unsignalled. When you don't know that you're about to be given morphine, or you don't know exactly when, the physiological response, the measurable physiological response to morphine is greater than giving the exact same dose to the person, but giving them control over when they'll take it. So it's a really powerful demonstration of the role that the mind plays in the effect of a drug. There is overwhelmingly the effect of a drug is physiological. We can't just completely think ourselves out of the effect, but a proportion of the effect that a drug can have is mediated by our expectancies and our experiences. So the slide that I just referred to is here. This was, again, if you're not a fan of animal research, I think even if you don't have a problem with animal research, you probably think this study itself was a bit grim, and I'd agree. This was a study carried out in '82 by Siegel and colleagues, looking at the impact of environment on overdose. So it was an animal study involving rats using what we call Skinner boxes, and a Skinner box is effectively just a controlled environment in which you can keep small animals for research purposes, where you have a high level of control over the environment they're in. So look across the top row there, you've got time one, a group of rats in the control group who are not given any heroin. So these are the controls in our experiment. In group one, the group are given a low dose of heroin that is increasingly tapered until the rats are demonstrating dependence, physical dependence on heroin. And the exact same thing happens in group two. At time two, what they do is to leave the control group in the same environment, to put group one into a different coloured Skinner box, so their environment has changed. That's the only thing that changes. And again, to leave group two, who are also, so group one and group two are the dependent groups. So group one get put into a different situation, group two get left in the same environment. All three groups are then given a high dose of heroin, and it's a high dose in the sense of being slightly higher than the maximum dose that the group one and group two rats had been habituated to, they'd become dependent on. So it was a slightly higher dose, a kind of a potential overdose. And what they were looking at, the outcome here, was the fatality rate. As you would expect, the group, the control group on the left there, who had not used, been given heroin at all, almost all of them died. That's what you'd expect. The dose that a person or indeed an animal can take of a drug like heroin, if they're not already tolerant to the effects of it, if you give them a high dose, it can be fatal in many cases, and that's what happened here. So what this demonstrated experimentally was that this was a really high dose. It was a high enough dose to kill most rats who were drug naive. In the group on the far right there, who were left in the same environment, it killed a third of the rats. So it was still, again, evidence of the fact that this was a higher dose than they were used to, and that it led to an overdose and fatality in a third of cases. But the really telling group were the group who were put into a different environment. The rats who were in a different environment, who were then given the same high dose, 2/3 of them died as a result. And what this demonstrates is this idea of the effect of environment on a process like overdose, a very clinically relevant, of course, you'll agree, a very clinically relevant outcome. And this is just a really simple, albeit slightly grim, demonstration of the role that these classically conditioned cues around us can play. The very small things, particularly when a person is using a drug like heroin that can, has a very high potential for overdose and can be very, if you take slightly too much, you can easily overdose. But equally, if your environment changes, that could be enough to precipitate this more negative outcome. So what have we learned? Hopefully what you've seen and have come to understand is the role that learning can play in the development of addiction. I mentioned at the very start that an important thing about learning theory is not to see it as being an absolutely adequate and sufficient explanation for all aspects of the very complicated thing that is addictive behaviour, and equally for all types of behaviour you could make similar arguments. But I think it's useful to understand the positioning of learning theory as being one of the earliest attempts to explain in a systematic scientific way the processes that underpin the development of addictive behaviours. As we go through in future sessions, looking at different other theoretical models, it's useful, and I find it's useful conceptually to be looking through to see what elements of learning theory are kind of still there, because they do underpin a lot of human behaviour and learning. So they're a necessary, operant and classical conditioning are a necessary component of any complete understanding of human behaviour. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient in their own right. There's more we need to understand, and that's what we'll come on to in future sessions.